On a cold Tuesday morning in early April of 1981, a farmer named Elias Boone walked into the only farm supply store in Ash Creek, Nebraska Panhandle, and asked for something that made the whole room go still for 2 seconds before anyone laughed. He did not ask for spring wheat seed. He did not ask for nitrogen. He did not ask for pesticide. And he did not ask for parts for a boom sprayer. Elias set his hat on the worn wooden counter, brushed a thin layer of road dust from the sleeve of his faded canvas jacket, and looked straight at the man behind the register. "I need native wildflower seed," he said. "The kind that brings in beneficial insects." Cliff Mercer, the store owner, had been writing down an order for insecticide in a thick ledger. He looked up slowly, almost as if he thought he had heard the man wrong. Cliff had been selling farm supplies in Ash Creek for nearly 20 years. He had sold everything a plains farmer might need to drag a crop through drought, through hot wind, through pests, and through another year of uncertain grain prices. He sold millet seed. He sold wheat seed. He sold oil, belts, filters, fertilizer, herbicide in bulk, and pesticide in metal cans marked with skull and crossbones warnings. But in all those years behind that counter, no one had ever walked into this store and asked for flower seed. "Wildflowers," Cliff repeated, slowly, like he was trying out a foreign word. "You mean the kind people plant by the porch?" "No," Elias said. "For wheat ground." That answer made all 4 men standing near the coffee pot turn around. On the left was Ray Danner, who farmed 500 acres south of the dry creek and drove a 2-tone Chevy C10 shiny enough to reflect the whole sky off the hood. Beside him stood Harold Pike, who had just spent nearly $4,000 on a new pull-type boom sprayer and talked about it the way some men talk about a new airplane. Next to Harold was Vern Holloway, president of the county farm board, a man who said the words modern agriculture with the steady certainty of someone who believed he had personally invented it. And by the front window stood Cole Madsen, not yet 25, trying to hold together the family place after his father collapsed in the middle of harvest the year before. That morning, every one of them had come in for the same reason: pests. Last season had been bad. This year, the county extension man, Neil Barker, had already warned that the infestation might come earlier. The counter was crowded with silver cans of insecticide, folded paper sacks of chemical dust, and handwritten price cards marked in red pencil. The store smelled like fertilizer, burlap, motor oil, and that sharp bitter edge of poison that hung in the air long after the lids were sealed. That was what farming smelled like in the early 1980s on the high plains. Dry, hard, and full of confidence that if nature gave you trouble, you could beat it back with enough chemistry. And now Elias Boone had stepped into the middle of all that, and asked for flowers. Ray Danner laughed first. It was not cruel at first. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when an idea sounds too strange for his mind to land on anything else. "Flowers," Ray said. "In a wheat field. Elias, you feeling all right? Wind blow too much dust into your head?" Elias did not flinch. "I'm trying something different." "Different," Harold Pike said, resting one grease-marked hand on a pesticide can. "I just bought a new sprayer so I can cover my north quarter before the bugs get ahead of me. Barker says this season could eat a man alive if he hesitates. And you're planting flowers." Vern Holloway stepped forward half a pace. He was broad, comfortable, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never once needed to question his own judgment. "Elias," Vern said, "we all know you're not a fool. So let me ask plain. Are you short on money?" If cash is tight this season, the co-op has a deferred payment program. I can afford pesticide, Elias said. Then why not buy it? Because I don't want it. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. Don't want pesticide. In Ash Creek, in the spring of 1981, that sounded almost unnatural. To most of the men in that room, pesticide was not just another supply item. It was insurance. It was the answer they had been handed for years. It was instinct. It was the thing standing between a man and a failed crop. Cliff Mercer scratched at his jaw and glanced over the shelves behind him, as if maybe a bag of wildflower seed would appear just to rescue him from this conversation. I don't keep that in stock, he said. This is a farm supply store, not a garden shop. But I could ask a supplier up in North Platte. Maybe they can find some native grass mix, some seasonal bloom seed, something that brings in bees and butterflies. Probably take a week. Elias nodded. Order it. What exactly do you want? Coreopsis, blanket flower, yarrow, bee balm, and anything else that blooms in sequence from late spring through the end of summer. I want it along the fence rows, around the field edges, and in strips through the larger quarters. Cliff stared at him the way a man stares at someone who has calmly announced he plans to sow rain in June. You're really planting it, in the field? I am. It won't be cheap. Elias took out his old leather wallet and laid several folded bills on the counter. Order what you can. I'll take all of it. Behind him, the laughter came easier now. Lord, Ray said loudly enough for everyone to hear. He doesn't need pesticide anymore. He's fixing to feed the bugs with flowers. Harold laughed. Next year Elias will be selling honey instead of wheat. Vern crossed his arms and lifted his eyebrows. Maybe we ought to start calling him the Weed Man. That would fit better. That name cracked something open in the room. A few more men laughed. The Weed Man. Elias Boone heard every word. He stood still for a single second, long enough for the rough fingers of one hand to tighten on the brim of his hat. But he did not argue. He did not explain. He did not tell them about the corners of his fields, where he had seen fewer pests near the unsprayed margins. He did not tell them about the evenings he had driven more than 30 miles to the county library to read books on insects. He did not tell them about the brown notebook in the kitchen drawer at home, filled with small, careful handwriting and dates and field observations. He only picked up his work gloves, set his hat back on his head, and said to Cliff Mercer, "I'll be back next Tuesday." When the door closed behind him, the little brass bell gave a short, bright ring. April wind moved across the dirt lot outside, carrying the smell of dry soil and fresh weeds just waking up. Elias stepped down off the wooden porch, past the dusty pickup trucks parked out front, climbed into his own old truck, and started the engine. He never looked back at the store. But from that day on, the whole town began looking at him. Within days, the story spread all over Ash Creek. It reached the coffee shop where men sat over black coffee before sunrise and talked about grain prices. It passed through the scale house, the elevator yard, and the rows of folding chairs at church on Sunday. Everywhere it went, it picked up the same half-amused, half-certain tone. He's planting flowers in a wheat field. Not flowers. Weeds. Told you. A man lives out in the wind too long. Sooner or later his head goes with it. Just wait till July. Those fields of his will be a banquet for aphids. But Elias kept working as if he had heard none of it. He came back and picked up the seed. 2 weeks after that, people saw him driving his grain drill slowly along the eastern field edge. 3 weeks after that, dark bands of freshly worked ground began cutting across the green rows of spring wheat like rough stitches sewn through a piece of cloth that was supposed to remain clean and even. Men passing by slowed their trucks, squinted through the windshield, shook their heads, and drove on. Some laughed. Some pitied him. Some decided Elias Boone had simply grown tired of serious farming. None of them knew that those ridges of ground they were mocking would one day force the whole county to relearn how to look at a field. And none of them knew that by the summer of the 3rd year, when the pesticides stopped working and the wheat around Ash Creek began to fade under a brutal sky, the man they called the Weed Man would be the only one left with healthy gold standing across his land. The truth is, Elias Boone did not wake up one morning and decide to plant flowers in his wheat. It did not come from stubbornness, it did not come from rebellion, and it certainly did not come from any desire to prove the rest of the county wrong. It started years earlier, in a place most men would not have bothered to look. It was the summer of 1978, a dry year, the kind of year where the wind never quite stopped, and the soil felt like it might lift and carry itself away if you turned your back too long. The aphids had come early that season. By June, they were already thick on the lower leaves, tiny pale bodies clustered along the stems, drinking from the plants faster than the wheat could recover. Most men dealt with it the way they always had. Spray early, spray again if needed. Keep the numbers down before the damage got ahead of you. Elias had done the same thing. He ran his sprayer across the main fields, covered the rows in a fine drifting mist that hung in the air just long enough to remind you what it could do if you breathed too much of it. But that morning, he had walked further than usual. The sun had barely come up. The light was still thin, stretching long shadows across the ground. There was a fence line on the far side of his eastern field where the sprayer had not reached, not because he had planned it that way, just because he had run out of time the day before. That strip of land looked different. It wasn't clean. It wasn't uniform. There were weeds. There were patches of grass. There were small wild blooms pushing up where they could find space between the soil and the wheat. But the aphids there were not the same. They were still there, but they were fewer, broken into smaller clusters, not spreading the way they were in the sprayed sections of the field. Elias had stopped walking. At first, he thought maybe the wind had shifted differently along that edge, or the soil held a little more moisture, or something about the fence line changed the way the plants grew. Then he saw the movement. A small red shape landed on a wheat stalk, bright against the green. It moved slowly, almost carefully, like it knew exactly where it was going. A ladybug. Elias crouched down in the dirt, rested one elbow on his knee, and watched. The ladybug reached a cluster of aphids. There was no hesitation, no searching, just a quiet, steady motion. It ate one, then another, then another. Within less than a minute, that single insect had cleared most of the cluster. Elias did not move. He looked up and saw more. Not just one, dozens, then more. Small red shells scattered across the edge of the field, moving from plant to plant. And not just ladybugs. There were tiny green insects with long delicate wings resting near the stems. There were strange, almost invisible larvae creeping along the leaves, shaped like something between an ant and a small alligator. There were even smaller things he could barely see at all, moving in ways that did not look random. Elias stayed there longer than he meant to. The sun climbed higher. The air warmed. The rest of the field began to shimmer with heat, but that strip along the fence line held his attention. Because for the first time, he was seeing something he had never been taught to see.
The field was not just plants, it was movement, layers, relationships, and something in that small, overlooked strip of land was working. That night, Elias did something else that most men in Ash Creek did not do. He drove into town, and kept driving. Past the grain elevator, past the last set of lights, out toward the county line, until he reached the small public library that sat quiet under a dim porch light. Inside, the building smelled of paper and dust and old wood. There was a woman behind the desk who had known most of the town for years, and did not ask many questions when people came in looking for something they could not quite name. "You got anything on insects?" Elias asked. "What kind?" she said. Elias paused. "The kind that eat other insects." That was where it began. Not in a field. Not in a meeting. Not in a classroom. In a quiet building, with borrowed books, and a man who was willing to sit still long enough to read them. The library did not have much, but they could request things. Boxes came in from other towns, then from the state system, carrying books on entomology, field guides, research papers, and things most farmers would never think to open. Elias read them all. He read about predator and prey, about balance, about systems that have been working long before anyone started planting wheat on the plains. He read about insects that did not damage crops, but protected them. Ladybugs, lacewings, parasitic wasps, ground beetles that hunted at night beneath the soil. He learned that some of them needed nectar, some needed shelter. Some needed places to survive between seasons. And he learned something else, something no one had ever explained to him when they handed him a pesticide label. When you spray a field, you do not choose what lives and what dies. You only choose how much. The pests die, but so do the hunters. And they do not come back at the same speed. That idea stayed with him. It followed him back into his fields. It sat with him at the kitchen table. It crept into the way he looked at every acre he worked. And over time, it changed the question. The question was no longer, how do I kill what is hurting my crop? It became, what am I killing that might have been helping me? For 2 years, Elias Boone did not say much about what he was learning. He kept farming. Kept spraying when he thought he had to. Kept watching the edges of his fields in the early mornings when the air was still and the insects moved more slowly. He started noticing patterns. The places he left alone, recovered faster. The places he sprayed hardest, came back worse the next time. It did not make sense, until it did. And by the time he walked into Cliff Mercer's store that morning in April of 1981, the idea was no longer just a thought. It was a plan. A quiet one. A slow one. And one that he knew would make him look foolish for a while. But Elias Boone had already learned something more important than being right. He had learned how to wait.
The first year, nothing really changed. Elias planted the strips just like he had planned. Along the fence lines, around the edges, cutting through the larger fields in long, uneven bands that didn't follow the neat geometry the rest of the county preferred. From the road, it looked wrong, messy, like a man who had stopped caring about straight rows and clean fields. People noticed. Of course they noticed. They slowed their trucks when they drove past. They pointed. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Some didn't say anything at all, which in a place like Ash Creek meant they had already decided what they thought. The wheat still grew that first year. Not better. Not worse. Just normal. The pests came like they always did. The early wave in June. The second push in midsummer. Elias sprayed once, just enough to keep things from getting out of hand before anything had time to build. That was enough for the others to feel justified. See, Vern said one morning at the coffee shop. Even the weed man sprays when it matters. No one argued. Elias didn't either. He just kept walking his fields in the early morning. He started doing it every day. before the wind picked up, before the heat flattened everything into silence. He would step out into the rows while the light was still soft, boots brushing against damp leaves, moving slowly so he didn't disturb what he was trying to see. And little by little, things began to change. Not all at once. Not in a way you could measure on a yield report, but in ways you could feel, if you paid attention. There were more insects along the strips. At first, just a few. Then more. Then enough that he no longer had to search for them. Ladybugs appeared first. Small clusters near the edges. Then scattered deeper into the field. Then the lacewings. Then the strange, almost invisible larvae that moved like quiet predators across the leaves. Elias didn't talk about it. He wrote it down. Dates. Weather. What he saw. Where he saw it. Which parts of the field held more life. And which parts stayed empty. The second year, people started to notice something else. It was a bad season. Wetter spring. Warmer early summer. Perfect conditions for pests. The aphids came harder than the year before. Faster. Thicker. Farmers who had sprayed twice the year before were spraying 3 times now. Some 4. Mixing chemicals. Increasing rates. Running their rigs longer hours. Trying to stay ahead of something that never seemed to fall behind anymore. The bills started to climb. Fuel. Chemical. Repairs. Every pass across a field cost more than the last. And still, the bugs came back. Elias sprayed once. Early. Then he stopped. Not because he was confident. Because he was watching. Each morning, he walked his fields again. And this time, he didn't have to look hard. The insects were everywhere. Ladybugs on nearly every row. Swing larvae moving across leaves with a steady, deliberate hunger. Tiny wasps hovering close to the stems. Things working. Quietly. Constantly. The aphids were still there. But they never took over. Not the way they did in other fields. They would build, and then thin out. Build, and then fall back. Like something was holding them in place. Like something was feeding on them faster than they could grow. From the road, none of that was visible. From the road, it still looked like a mess. Flowers where there should have been nothing but wheat. Uneven lines. Breaks in the pattern. Excuses, people said. Or laziness. Or a man who had lost track of what farming was supposed to look like. At the grain elevator, they joked about him. Elias ain't growing wheat anymore, someone said. He's growing scenery. Another voice answered, give it another year. He'll be selling the land. Elias heard some of it. Not all. He didn't go out of his way to listen. He didn't go out of his way to explain either. He just kept doing the same thing. Plant. Watch. Write it down. Wait. At the end of that second year, the numbers told a quiet story. His yield was close to average. Maybe a little below. Nothing that would impress anyone. But his chemical cost was different. Much lower. Not by a little. By a lot. While other men were stacking invoices on their kitchen tables, Elias had very few to look at. No one talked about that part much. It wasn't as easy to joke about. Still, no one changed what they were doing. Not yet. Because from the outside, it still looked like Elias Boone was taking a risk no sensible man would take. And maybe he was. But there was one thing the others didn't see. Something that could not be seen from a truck window, or from across a fence. His fields were not empty. They were alive. And that difference was about to matter more than anything anyone had sprayed that year. The summer of 1983 came early. It started hot. And stayed hot. By the second week of May, the wind had already lost its spring softness. It moved across the fields in long, dry waves, carrying heat instead of cool air.
By June, the ground held that heat through the night, and the mornings no longer felt like relief. Those were the conditions pests waited for. And they came. Fast. Faster than anyone expected. The aphids showed up first, thick along the lower stems. Within days, they climbed higher, spreading across the leaves, gathering in clusters that grew heavier every morning. Farmers noticed immediately. They always did. The first response was automatic. Spray early. Stay ahead. Control it before it gets out of hand. So they sprayed. Once. Then again. Then again. By mid-June, the rigs were running constantly across the county. Long metal arms stretched wide over the fields, releasing fine drifting clouds that hung low before settling into the crops. Fuel burned. Chemical tanks emptied. Invoices grew. And still, the aphids did not slow down. At first, men blamed timing. Too late, someone said at the co-op. Should have gone earlier. So they went again. Stronger mix. Higher rate. Longer coverage. And still, nothing changed. The aphids kept building. Not slower. Not weaker. Stronger. Thicker. Like the spray wasn't even touching them anymore. By late June, something had shifted. You could feel it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Fields that should have been deep green started to lose color. The lower leaves turned dull first. Then pale. Then a tired yellow that spread upward through the plant. Heads formed, but lighter than they should have been. Stalks stood, but weaker. Men stood at the edges of their land and stared at it, hands on their hips, trying to calculate something that no longer added up. They sprayed again. Because that was what you did. Because that was what had always worked. Because there was nothing else left to try. By early July, the county extension office called a meeting. The room filled fast. Men came in with dust still on their boots, sweat dried into their shirts, caps pulled low over tired eyes. The air inside felt heavier than the heat outside. Neil Barker stood at the front. He looked different. Less certain. He held a clipboard, but didn't look at it much. It's resistance, he said finally. No one spoke. The aphids aren't responding to the chemicals the way they used to. We're seeing reduced effectiveness across multiple treatments. What do we switch to? Ray Danner asked from the back. Neil hesitated. We don't have anything better available right now. Silence again. What do you mean, nothing? Harold Pike said, voice tight. There's always something. Not this season, Neil said quietly. The room shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But something inside it dropped.
For the first time, the system they had trusted without question was not giving them an answer. And outside that room, the fields kept getting worse. By mid-July, whole sections of wheat were failing, not all at once, not in a way that made a clean line, but in patches. Then in larger patches. Then in stretches that reached from one end of a field to the other. The plants stood, but empty. Heads light, grain missing. Life already pulled out of them. Spray rigs sat at the edges of fields with nothing left to do. Men walked rows they had walked their whole lives, and didn't recognize what they were seeing anymore. There was only one place in Ash Creek that did not look like that. Elias Boone's land. From the road, it didn't make sense. It should have looked worse. He had sprayed less. Spent less. Ignored what everyone else had been told to do. And yet, his fields still held color. Still held weight. Still moved with that steady, living texture under the wind. You could see it from a distance. A difference you couldn't explain. Ray Danner was the first to stop and look. He pulled his truck over along the dirt road that ran between his land and Elias's, killed the engine, sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel. On his side of the fence, the wheat was failing. Short, pale, stretched thin under a pressure it couldn't resist. Even from where he sat, he could see the aphids. Thick on the stems, covering the leaves. Moving in numbers that made your skin crawl if you looked too long. On the other side, Elias's field stood tall. Not perfect, but strong, full, alive.
And cutting through it, those same strips people had laughed at. Bands of color. Yellow, white, faded red, running through the wheat like something that didn't belong, but clearly did. Ray opened the truck door, stepped down, walked to the fence, stood there. Then, without calling out, without asking, he climbed through. That was not something farmers did. Not without permission. Not without reason. But this was reason enough. He walked into the field slowly, not like a man inspecting. Like a man trying to understand something he already knew didn't make sense. He stopped at the first row, bent down, looked close. There were aphids. Of course there were. But not many. Scattered, broken, held in place. Then he saw it. A ladybug. Moving up the stem, steady, purposeful. It reached a cluster, and began to eat. One. Then another. Then another. Ray stayed there, watching. He looked up, and saw more. Everywhere. Not just one. Dozens. Then more. Across the rows. Across the leaves. Across the entire field. And when he looked closer, he saw things he had never paid attention to before. Small larvae. Green-winged insects lifting off from the flower strips. Tiny shapes moving in ways that did not look random at all. The field was working. Not empty.
Not under control because of chemicals. Under control because something inside it was doing the work. Ray stood there for a long time. The heat didn't matter. The dust didn't matter. Nothing else mattered. Because for the first time in his life, he was looking at a field and realizing he had never really seen one before. "They're eating them," he said quietly. No one answered. No one needed to. He could see it. That evening, just before the light dropped off the fields, Ray Danner drove down the same road again. This time, he didn't stop at the fence. He drove all the way to Elias Boone's house. Parked, sat for a moment, then stepped out, walked up to the porch, and knocked. Elias Boone opened the door before the second knock. He was still in his work clothes, dust on his boots, sleeves rolled, the kind of look that said the day had not really ended yet, just paused for a moment. He looked at Ray Danner, and didn't seem surprised. "Evening," Elias said. Ray nodded once. "Didn't step inside right away. I walked your field today," he said. "Didn't ask." "That's all right." Ray hesitated. "I saw what's out there." Elias waited. Ray took a breath. "I don't understand it, but I know it's working." That was the closest thing to an admission a man like Ray Danner had ever made. "I need you to show me," he said. They sat on the porch as the sun went down. The air cooled just enough to make it bearable. The wind slowed. Somewhere out past the fields, you could hear the faint hum of insects rising with the evening. Elias's wife brought out iced tea without saying much. Set the glasses down. Left them there to talk. And they talked. Not for a few minutes. Not for an hour. For most of the night. Elias didn't rush it. He didn't lecture. He didn't say, "I told you." He just explained. Slowly. Simply. The way a man explains something he understands. Not something he's trying to prove. He talked about what he had seen along the fence lines. About the insects that showed up when you left space for them. About how some of them hunted. Quietly. Constantly. In ways no chemical ever could. He talked about timing. About spraying early. If you had to. But not too late. About letting something build. Instead of killing everything and starting over every season. He talked about the balance most men had never been taught to look for. And Ray listened. Really listened. The way a man listens when something inside him has already begun to change. By the time the light was gone, Ray's notebook was full. Names. Dates. Sketches. Questions. Answers. Not all of it made sense yet. But enough of it did. Enough to try. The next week, Ray called a meeting. Word spread fast. Faster than the story about the flowers had spread 2 years earlier. This time, no one laughed. They came because they had to. Because something had broken. Because what they trusted was no longer working. Because they needed something, anything, that might. The room filled past capacity. Men stood along the walls, sat on window ledges. Leaned against the doorframe, some brought their sons, some brought their wives. All of them brought the same thing, worry. Elias stood at the front. Same man, same quiet posture. Same steady voice. Only difference, no one was smiling now. He told them what he knew. Not everything, just what mattered. He showed them where to start. Where to plant, what to watch. What not to do. He didn't promise quick results. Didn't promise perfect fields. Didn't promise anything, really, just a different way to think about what was already there. Then someone asked the question no one expected. Vern Holloway, the same man who had laughed the loudest. Why would you help us? Vern said. After all that, the room went quiet again. Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out across the faces in front of him. Men he had known for years. Men who had joked about him. Men who had called him names. Men who now looked tired and unsure. Because you're my neighbors, Elias said. That's reason enough. After that, things changed. Not overnight. Not cleanly. Some men tried it and gave up. Some couldn't wait long enough to see it work. Some had already lost too much. They sold, left, or stopped farming altogether. But others stayed. They planted strips. They watched. They waited. They learned to tolerate a little damage, for the sake of something more stable. And slowly, the fields changed. Not just in color. In feeling. In movement. In what lived there. And what didn't. Years later, people would give it names. Integrated pest management. Biological control. Habitat systems. They would write papers about it. Teach it in universities. Turn it into something that sounded complex. But on that porch, that night, it had been simple. Watch. Learn. Work with what's already there. Elias Boone never asked for recognition. He never left Ash Creek, never stood on a stage, never wrote a book. He just kept farming, the same land, the same way, season after season. And if you drive through that county now, you can still see it. Not his name, not a sign, just the fields, lines of wheat, broken by strips of color. Flowers where there used to be nothing. Movement where there used to be silence. And if you stop your truck, step out, and walk into one of those fields early in the morning, you'll see them. Ladybugs. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Moving slowly across the stems, doing the same work they've always done. No one laughs at that anymore. But they did once. And it only took one man, willing to look wrong for a few years, to show them what they had been missing the whole time.